I'm Jim Mackay of the Kirkmichael Trust in the Black Isle here in Scotland, and hopefully my accent is understandable across in America, but I think there's a few folk joining us here from Scotland as well, so welcome from both sides to people on both sides of the Atlantic. I've been burrowing in the archives to discover the life and times of William Trent, merchant of Inverness, and father of William Trent, whose house in Trenton is now the 1719 William Trent House Museum. William Trent, the father, was a busy and diverse merchant and entrepreneur based in the port of Inverness in the 1600s, coming to prominence during its occupation by Oliver Cromwell's army in the 1650s. And here, if this little pointer of mine works, you can see Inverness in the 1600s with the Bewley Firth behind, which runs along behind the city of Inverness, and behind that the bonny Black Isle, where I am currently located and where Kirkmichael is located. And in this contemporary image, you can see in the far left a few remnants of Oliver Cromwell's great citadel, and on the right, old Inverness Castle. Within the centre here, the old High Church, which is where William Trent would have worshipped, and it's actually still there if you visit Inverness nowadays. And by the way, if you want more in this story about William Trent, merchant of Inverness, or wish to learn about the work of the Kirkmichael Trust here in the Black Isle, Scotland, just follow the link there, or you can simply Google Kirkmichael Trust to find your way to us. The Kirkmichael Trust, as we've just heard, is a community trust which has restored and now maintains medieval Kirkmichael. And that's part of our display there of medieval ornate crosses within the nave of Kirkmichael. So please come to visit us when you're next in Scotland. And commercial over. Just a quick reminder of how different the world was in Trent's time. You have great chunks of the world ruled by European countries. We have France, which ruled quite an area of the American continent from the north right to the south. You've got England with their possessions in Carolina, Virginia, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, New York, New England, that incredibly rich and important eastern seaboard. And I've deliberately included Sweden over here, which at the time held areas within what is nowadays called Germany, but also had settlements, particularly in the Pennsylvania area. And I mention this as William Trent's eldest son, James, served in the Swedish forces and later worked in America in conjunction with a Swedish merchant. And William Trent's second son, Maurice Trent, actually married a girl of Swedish origin from Uppland in New Sweden, nowadays known as Chester County in Pennsylvania. And of course, we'll come to William Trent's third eldest son, who founded what became known as Trent Town or Trenton in New Jersey. But first, some dates, and I'm well aware that this is the reason why we all hated history in school. But in 1649, King Charles I was executed. The Parliament of Scotland promptly declared his son, Charles II, as King of Britain, which was a dangerous move as the ruthless Oliver Cromwell saw Scotland as a hostile force to be dealt with. In 1650, Scotland was rapidly raising an army, And in response, the new model army under Cromwell invaded Scotland. Cromwell won 2 decisive battles, and Scotland became part of the Commonwealth. In December 1653, Cromwell became Lord Protector, a role which he remained until his death just 5 years later in 1658. And then it all unravelled. The monarchy was restored, and Charles II promptly ordered all the Cromwellian fortifications to be demolished, including the citadel at Inverness. And nowadays, few people in Scotland are even aware of Cromwell's role in Scottish history. And a quick reminder to the main locations within the story. At this time, Scotland up here and England were separate countries, although both within the Commonwealth imposed by Oliver Cromwell. Up in the north of Scotland, we have Inverness, where Cromwell had built a massive citadel to keep the surrounding area quiet. William Trent, Sr., is first recorded in Inverness in 1657. Down here is Edinburgh, the capital of Scotland, and it is served by the nearby port of Leith, which is just north of Edinburgh, and is where another great citadel was built. Maurice Trent, William's brother, is first recorded here in Leith in 1653. And away down here is London. But in fact, although it's some distance, it is in fact just a coastal sea voyage away from Inverness. And you might think that London would not feature in this story, but William Trent, Sr., and some other Inverness merchants were in London in 1660, and some of the events were recorded by a friend, young James Fraser, who fortunately kept a diary. Thus, we have lovely touches as when Fraser and Trent spot the former Cromwell governor at Inverness skulking about a lane in London. The monarchy were back in power, and Cromwellian officers were not popular. Fraser says, meantime, William Trent and I, coming one day from London Bridge, and this is the very same London Bridge of the time over which Trent and Fraser were coming. We spotted Thomas Fitch, once governor and colonel to the English regiment at Inverness, whom I saw in grandeur and state there. We spy him in a private lane, most dejected, all alone, but he knew not us. These happy changes, the restoration of the monarchy, had brought such snakes to skulk up and down the city obscurely and in disguise. So that you can tell that Fraser and William Trent were not great fans of Cromwell. And this, I can just show it here. This is a contemporary plan of the great citadel built by Cromwell in Inverness on the River Ness itself. Many fine church buildings were pillaged to supply the stone out of which it was constructed. It was built over the period 1653 to 1658, and then, as I say, Cromwell died, and King Charles II ordered all such fortifications to be torn down. All that remains now is part of the rampart, this corner here, which if you come down Cromwell Road in Inverness to Lotland Place, you can still see the corner of the citadel rampart. These remains are now well protected by legislation, and there was a major fuss just a few years ago when a digger driver, I guess that's what you'd call a backhoe driver in America, started excavating a big hole in it. Well, I thought it was just a big heap of soil, he said. Well, it is, but it's rather a special big heap of soil. And this is typical of the sources in which I've been finding the life and times of William Trent. This is a volume of the minutes of the Borough of Inverness from the 1600s held in Highland Archives. Many of these minutes and of the Inverness Register of Deeds are badly faded. The spelling and even the handwriting are different to what we're now used to. But in these tattered pages can be found everything from financial records to marriage contracts. And on this very page, I found the earliest record of William Trent Sr. in Inverness. And I've developed the image to make it a wee bit more readable and actually typed it out, as writing from the 1600s can be a wee bit challenging if you're not used to it. So the first time we meet William Trent, he's being enrolled as a burgess and guild brother in Inverness in December 1657. Oliver Cromwell is still alive. Scotland is under military rule. The gigantic citadel built by Cromwell within Inverness is nearing completion. And William Trent is looking for business. In presence of the provost and several bailies, and having paid the requisite fee of £10 sterling, which was a lot of money then, he is registered as a burgess and guild brother of the Borough of Inverness. And I should explain that burgesses at this time were merchants or craftsmen, and they alone could enjoy the privileges of trading or practicing a craft in the city. William Trent's route to establishing himself as a merchant lay through his becoming a merchant, burgess. And Inverness Harbour, of course, was absolutely key to William Trent's trading activity, because at this time, everything was done by boat. And he himself was engaged by the town council to build a new pier and bulwark at the harbour. He was thereby being paid to do something that would benefit the merchants of Inverness, including himself. And that's a pattern you find with William Trent. He was very clever in the way he did business. And here we see typical ships of Trent's time actually on the River Ness in Inverness, with remains of Cromwell's citadel behind. And this present document is so important, I include quite an extract from it. It is the discharge of William Trent's marriage contract with his wife, Issobell Stuart's father, Inverness merchant John Stuart, and his eldest son, James Stuart. The dowry was 1,500 merks, a merk being 13 shillings and fourpence. And for those who are good at sums, that's quite a lot. Isabel's father, John, was an important, influential merchant and magistrate in the town. Her brother James was similarly a powerful merchant and magistrate. The two of them keep cropping up in Inverness deeds, town council records, even in Kirk session and hospital records. They were pillars of the community in Inverness. I do hope it was a love match between the young Isabel, who was only 17 years old, and the wily merchant William Trent. But if so, it was still great business for him. And they went on to have at least 7 children. Trent seems to have been something of an opportunist. The council every year put up certain of their assets for let, and when his canny bid was the highest, he would secure odd pieces to exploit for the year. In 1664, he secured for a year the flesh stock and shambles, this being the outdoor area of Inverness utilised for butchering meat, a profitable area to hold. And in 1675, he secured for a year the salt measure and weigh house. And as every merchant had to use the official town weights, it would be lucrative to hold this tenancy, albeit for a year only. And this building here Provost Dunbar's Hospital incorporates the very weigh house held by William Trent. If you're in Inverness, you can go in for a cup of tea because there's a cafe inside nowadays. The ground floor to the left of the doorway was where the weigh house was located. And you might think that a hospital is a funny place to have a weigh house, but bear with me, I'll come to it. But in the meanwhile, note the crow step gabling on the building and the ornate stone carvings above each of the dormer windows. A tremendous building. And if we look first at the very first of those carvings above a dormer window, we see the date 1668, when the hospital was created, and the figure of a sick old man tapping along with his stick. The inscription reads, "This poor man cried," which is part of a quotation from the Bible, a quotation which carries on the remainder of the stone carvings above the dormer windows. It's a wonderful piece of history. And above the doorway is this carved panel, also dated 1668, which explains the link between the weigh house and the hospital. It reads, "This weigh house belongs to the Hospital of Inverness, the rent thereof payable by the master of the weigh house to the treasurer of the said hospital." So when William Trent rented the weigh house, his money was going towards the upkeep of the hospital. And here you see the entry in the borough books when William Trent Sr. secured the weigh house. That day, it reads, "The weigh house and salt measure after public auction is set to William Trent for this ensuing year from Michaelmas last to Michaelmas next, 1676, for payment of £30 Scots." And you can see his signature under the entry in a bold hand, William Trent. And you always know it's William Trent signing because he'd a most peculiar way of putting the T in for the Trent of William Trent. William Trent had a finger in every pie. He, along with several others, including the Earl of Seaforth and Lord Tarbot, owned a frigate, the Dolphin of Inverness. And I found in the minutes that the Dolphin captured an enemy cargo ship, the Dow of Horn, carrying a diverse cargo of oaken timber, 25 gans, buckskins, goat skins, and cow hides. And this was all profit to the owners of the Dolphin, which had captured her. So Trent made money out of the Dolphin. And this is the most famous loch in Scotland, Loch Ness, where the Loch Ness monster occasionally puts in an appearance for those who are especially worthy. And on its shore is Castle Urquhart, one of the most visited sites in Scotland. It was owned at the time by the Laird of Grant, and in 1676, William Trent was commissioned to coordinate repairs to this famous castle. And amazingly, we have a letter from Trent himself to the Laird of Grant. And this is the only letter by William Trent Sr. extant as far as I'm aware. It reads, and I do abbreviate it considerably, "Inverness, 20th April 1676. I have received your honours letter with 200 merks to be laid out for the repairing of your castle in Urquhart, which I shall do according to your honours' order, God willing. I sent away the masons 2 days ago with all the materials needful and supplied them with money. I desired your uncle for to send down horses for lime, which I have ready for them. I hope it will be ready for the slates shortly. And then I cut to the end. I rest your honour's most humble servant to power, William Trent. And that was probably the last time that Castle Urquhart was repaired. Well, William Trent cannily purchased chunks of Cromwell's vast Inverness fortification, the Citadel, or Sconce, as it was known locally, with the intention of selling them back to the town for the materials to be used in building projects. A wily chap. And this is one of those projects, the first stone bridge in Inverness crossing the River Ness. It replaced a ramshackle wooden structure which was so unsafe people had been warned from using it. But William died before the project could be finished. And so the Borough Council liaised with William's brother, Maurice Trent and Leith, to access William's supplies of building materials in order to progress the project. And the new 7-arch bridge with stone from the Citadel lasted from the 1680s through to 1849, when it was swept away by floods. And the Illustrated London News of 10th February 1849 featured a dramatic picture of the event drawn by an Inverness architect who was on the spot when it happened. So who needs TikTok? One of our volunteers at Kirkmichael, archaeologist Jonathan Wordsworth, participated in a recent archaeological investigation which revealed one of the pier bases of the stone bridge still under the river. The River Ness has been flowing over it for hundreds of years, and what you're seeing in Jonathan's picture here are a few of the thousands of stone blocks which were the subject of negotiations between the town council and first William Trent and then Maurice Trent back in the 1600s. Trent owned a shop in Inverness, and we know he sold everything from green ginger to muskets. He had a substantial store of sack and brandy. But as we just heard, Trent was far more than just a trader. He purchased much-built land in Inverness. He was a landlord, took on major building projects. He owned a kiln in town, and he held a tack of land at Drakey's. His marriage with the young Issobell Stewart had been very beneficial to him, as the Stewart family had a network of contacts and markets themselves. William Trent does not seem to have sought political importance. His focus was always on business. But there is clear indication of how he was perceived in Inverness, as he was appointed in charge of one of the companies of militia set up in the 1660s. And why were they needed? Well, one of the downsides of the loss of Cromwell's military presence was an upsurge in lawlessness throughout the country. And Inverness felt vulnerable to the depredations of Highland chieftains. The magistrates and council were therefore vigorous in ensuring the militia were vigilant. So William Trent and the other captains of companies took turns lasting 24 hours in providing a guard to the area. And you can see here Cromwell's clock tower, built from citadel stone, of course, 24 hours had to pass before Trent and his company marching around Inverness could stand down. Well, it can be seen from his business activities that William Trent was active right up to his death, which must have been rather sudden. We see him as a witness at the baptism of a friend's child in June 1676, at the baptism of his own child Thomas in October 1676. He had just taken on new projects. He had a large family, some of whom were still very young. And then, quite suddenly, it would appear, he died. He left no will. His affairs were complex and needed close supervision. It was a challenging time for widow Issobell and her young family. However, her children would not have starved. She had her numerous Stuart relatives who would have ensured that there was plenty of haggis on the plates of her children. And of course, there was William's rich brother, Maurice Trent and Leith, willing to help as well. We know that Issobell paid the physician's fees and the funeral expenses. One of the big queries, though, is where was he buried? Uniquely, we have a copy of his gravestone inscription, but we don't know where his grave is. There are 3 options in Inverness, and this is the first option, the graveyard around the old High Church, where Trent and his family worshipped. But whilst the church was definitely there in William Trent's time, very, very few of the stones in the graveyard date back to the 1600s. Similarly, there are several gravestones here in Greyfriars Cemetery that also date from the 1600s, and indeed this battered knight effigy, and that's the one on the right, is even older than that. But there are very few memorials in Greyfriars, so by far the most likely location for William Trent's burial is here in Chapel Yard, a big graveyard crammed with old memorials, including many from the 1600s. Here, for example, are 2 dedicated to the Anderson brothers, who were active as periwig makers and burgesses in Inverness at the same time as William Trent. Now, I mentioned that we have the strange situation of having William Trent's inscription, but not his gravestone. How can this be? Well, the inscriptions in Chapel Yard have been recorded several times, but William Trent does not appear in any of the more recent publications. You can be sure that he would have had a good memorial, as he was an important and wealthy merchant. But alas, many of the oldest wall panels and slabs in Chapel Yard, like these here, are simply broken or not now readable. But in an old book of Scottish inscriptions published in 1834, 15 inscriptions found in Inverness were printed, including, amazingly, one for William Trent, his monument. It doesn't give any more of the inscription than the warning to live a good life, as death is just around the corner. But we should be delighted that this at least has survived. And I've broken the lines to emphasize the rhyme, William Trent, his monument. While time doth run, from sin depart, for none can shun death's piercing dart. Now, following William Trent's death in 1677, brother Maurice Trent and Leith takes over. He succeeded in being nominated executor of William Trent's estate, so all the business dealings were now through him. An inventory of what William Trent had possessed and what was owed to him was drawn up so that Maurice could officially take action in chasing debts. For example, the Laird of Grant, who you may remember had Trent repairing Castle Urquhart for him, was still owing Trent quite a sum of money. But there were many, many more debts to chase up. At the top, here's one out of dozens of items where Sir John Munro of Fowles owed him £20 and interest thereon. And below is what William Trent had in the way of materials when he died. The whole utensils and domiciles with the stones, and that will be the stone blocks in the yard and about the house, and a quantity of roofing slate lying in the citadel, all estimate to £300. Item, the merchandise in the shop and cellar, and planks in the loft with the lighter, and that's a kind of boat, and a remnant of the sack and brandy, all estimate to £1,260. And I have to say that William Trent's house and business yard must have been in quite a state, with piles of stone and planks and roofing slate all over the shop. Now, of course, as well as having money owed to him, he owed money to others. So it was a tangled financial position that Morris had to sort out. One of the strangest debts was from the Dean of Ross, the very senior church officer in Rossshire. He must have been going through dangerous times, as he owed William Trent £6 for a musket and bandoliers. At this time, bandoliers consisted of a belt carrying wooden containers, each filled with just the right amount of charge for one shot of the musket. To be fair, the Dean of Ross may have been fond of shooting game and not people, but nevertheless not what you would expect from a churchman. Now, we know from his rentals that William Trent held farmland here at Drakey's, just southeast of Inverness at that time, but swallowed up by Inverness by now. As ever, that's the Bewley Firth, an inlet of the North Sea, running between Inverness and the bonny Black Isle beyond. At the front here is Drakey's house, built fairly recently in 1820. But when William Trent held Drakey's back in the 1670s on a tenancy from Lord Macdonnell, it was all open farmland. Now, he wasn't a farmer himself, of course. He didn't operate that way. He sublet it to tenant farmers who paid him a yearly sum, and that's how he operated. On his death, Brother Morris set about obtaining the unpaid rents. We read in William's testament dative that Rory MacPhyper is to pay 22 bowls of grain, and so on with the other tenancies. So substantial rents being paid, not money, but in volumes of grain. So Morris Trent and Leith took over. He asked Issobell Stewart, William's widow, to work as his factor, or factrix, as he called it, in the matter of recovering rent for the kiln previously belonging to William Trent. And a kiln was a building used for drying grain, something rather important here in Scotland, where the climate can be a little on the damp side. And here's an image of a grain drying kiln from nearby Elgin. Issobell collected the rent for the kiln and signed receipts over the period 1682 to 1685. And I'm quite sure she would have acted as factrix for Morris in other situations too, but these are the only receipts surviving. And these particular receipts were written by Inverness merchant Charles Stewart, who signs himself as a witness down here. He was a brother of Issobell. It was also signed, obviously, by Issobell herself, and that's Issobell Stewart, William Trent Sr.'s own signature there. And they are also witnessed by various other people, including William Trent Jr., who signs himself, who is called in these documents William Trent Student in Inverness. And some of them are signed by Morris Trent, who is also described in the receipt as student in Inverness as well. So you can see that several of the children of William Trent Sr. were in fact quite young when William Trent died. Now, no story about William Trent, merchant of Inverness, would be complete without reference to brother Morris Trent, merchant of Leith. And in fact, he was incredibly reluctant to stir from Leith, and actually got into trouble for it when he became a Burgess of Edinburgh, because he had to promise to move the fairly short distance from Leith to Edinburgh. But I see years later, the Edinburgh Burgesses threatening to throw him out as he still hadn't moved. And in America, he worked through his Inverness nephews, James, Morris, and William, on his trading and land deals in Pennsylvania and New Jersey. He bought the estate of Pitcallow in Fife for his son William Trent, and thereby established a Trent of Pitcallow dynasty. And his daughter Elizabeth married Sir James Falconer of Fesdo. So he was moving in high circles. Morris Trent seems to have been the only member of the two Trent families who became a Quaker, although several of the others, such as William Trent of Trenton, benefited from a close association with the Society of Friends. And when did Morris become a Quaker? Well, I think it must have been long after the 1650s. And here's Pendle Hill in Lancashire in England, photographed by my son Gavin, who coincidentally was climbing it as I was preparing this Trent story, which is spooky or what. But it's up here that the originator of the Society of Friends, George Fox, had a vision of a great multitude coming together. Now, George Fox visited Edinburgh in the 1650s and converted quite a few of the folk in Edinburgh and Leith to Quakerism. But we can tell that Morris didn't become an adherent at this time, as his children were baptized here in the Church of South Leith. Quakers held no respect for churches, considering them just steeple houses. And this church was closed for several years of the Cromwell administration because of its proximity to the Leith citadel, despite petitions to have it reopened. And again, Morris Trent was involved in those petitions, something I very much doubt he would have done if he was a member at that time of the Society of Friends. But he was certainly a trusted member of the Quakers by 1681, as a minute of the Edinburgh Friends in that year contains an instruction that Friends do hereby empower Morris Trent to agree with an honest mason to build a good large meeting house on the end of the burial ground. And as a matter of interest, here is that Quaker burial ground in the Pleasance in Edinburgh, and you can see the line of Quaker memorials running up the wall on the west side there. And I have to include this. This is Pitcallow Castle in Fife, bought as part of the Pitcallow estate by Morris Trent for his son William Trent. The castle was in the hands of the Trents for at least 70 years. And curiously, there are in fact 5 magnificent Lego designs for Picalo Castle available online, created by Robert Carney, who has given me permission to include these images. So if you're a great Lego fan, you might want to try building your very own Trent Picalo Castle. But of course, you don't go around buying estates and real castles unless you're seriously rich, and you'll gather from this that Maurice Trent had done very well in life. Now, I've been discussing the world of William Trent, merchant of Inverness. So a few words about his 7 known children. We know nothing about 2 of them. That's Thomas Trent and Anna Trent, the youngest 2. It may be that they died young, or else they've just simply escaped under our radar. 2 of his daughters, Elizabeth Trent and Janet Trent, remarkably managed to marry 3 ministers between them. And Elizabeth Trent married one of the Andersons of the estate of Udale, adjacent to Kirkmichael here in the Black Isle. So a strong local connection. Son James Trent became an officer in the Swedish forces, where he made contacts that are later very helpful in his career as a merchant mariner in Philadelphia. We don't know everything that he shipped, but we know that he shipped tobacco to the UK and indentured servants to New Jersey and Philadelphia. He also voyaged to Barbados, so active in the West Indian trade, where so many fortunes were made, but where so many men died young. And indeed, James Trent died still a young man. Son Maurice Trent seems to have been a particular favourite of his uncle Maurice and Leith, who called him my truly and well-beloved friend and nephew, with friend having special significance to the uncle, who was a member of the Society of Friends. Young Maurice acted for his uncle in some of his land deals in New Jersey and Philadelphia, and the 2 of them are unfortunately closely associated with the scandal of non-indentured servants, some of them children, carried off from the streets of Scottish towns to serve time in the new country. And finally, son William Trent became the most famous Trent of all, becoming a merchant, landowner, and judge. He wasn't a Quaker, but was closely associated with them in business deals, and is thought to be buried in the Quaker burial ground in Trenton. His uncle, Maurice, loaned him money in May 1699. And it's a rather curious arrangement. The extract above reads, item, by William Trent, son to William Trent, merchant in Inverness, dated the 6th of May, 1699. And then there's the old Scots way of writing money, which I have to say is like a dark art to read, £673. And why did William Trent need an injection of cash in 1699? Well, in that year, he was actually working out of London as a merchant, which is when he made himself liable for the dowry for his sister Janet, a dowry of 2,000 merks, which I work out as £1,325, which curiously is just about double what he'd borrowed from his uncle Maurice. So, was it the dowry that William Trent was borrowing money for? If it was, he never did pay that dowry, perhaps feeling that Janet's minister husband could fend for himself. And so the interest on that debt kept growing. And Janet's grandson was still seeking payment of the dowry from William's descendants in America 2 generations later. The debt by then was substantial, as it was growing by £100 a year, and was, quoting from the relevant document, resting by the deceased William Trent, designed in the contract of marriage underwritten merchant in London, thereafter merchant in Philadelphia. William Trent, of course, is famous as a founder of Trentown or Trenton, New Jersey. His house in Trenton is now the 1719 William Trent House Museum. So he was born here in Inverness and died in Trenton. But as most of you will know much more about those latter days than I do, it's time for me to draw this look at the life and times of William Trent, merchant of Inverness, to a close.
Wonderful information. And I'm going to encourage people to either put your questions in chat or unmute yourself and ask a question. But I want to just point out the similarities in the life story between William Trent of Inverness and, quote unquote, our William Trent here in Trenton. Trent also married a very young woman as his second wife. He also died unexpectedly. He also left no will. He had a very complex estate, and it led to a lot of turmoil in the family, including a lawsuit between the young widow and the oldest son from our Trent's first marriage. I don't know how much our Trent learned from his father's experience, but it's amazing how similar it was. And I guess one of my questions is, was that fairly typical of the merchant class, that there would be such a complex estate that they would not be preparing wills? I'm just curious, because it seems so odd that it would be so, so parallel.
Well, at the time, merchants lived really through debt. People owed them money and they owed people money. And it was such a complex setup that if they ever died without leaving a will, it would take years, sometimes decades, for all the business affairs to be sorted out. When you look at a will, well, not a will, but what's called a testament dative, when you die without a will, a document called a testament dative is drawn up. You'll see things along the edge of them called eeks, E-I-K. It's a Scottish word meaning an addition to the will. And often there were debts that were found out about, like maybe several years or even decades after the testament dative was drawn up, and they'd be added in. So you'd go pursuing another debt which you weren't even aware of at the time that the settlement was made. Wills were actually relatively few and far between in those days. And when they did come in, actually did make life an awful lot easier, because quite often, if you owed a lot of money, your family would actually not want to inherit, because you would inherit the debts as well. And there would be court cases forcing children to inherit their father's estate, so that then they could be pursued for the debt in turn. And that actually, I didn't actually go into it here, but in fact there was a fiendishly complex set of litigation when William Trent died in Inverness, and his eldest son was indeed pursued in the courts to inherit his father's estate, so that then he could be pursued for debts. That was the eldest son, James. So that wills were few and far between, but when they were drawn up, they did make life far, far simpler. for the family.
Interesting. So I'm going to, there's a question or a comment maybe for us, meaning what information, if any, do we, and I guess that means both of us, Jim, have on Mary Burge, who was our William Trent's first wife? And do we know anything? Did he marry her while he was in Scotland? Did he marry her when he was living in Philadelphia? Do we know anything about that? And I don't know anything about it. So I'm going to see if you happen to have come up with anything.
There's absolutely no records of his marrying in Britain at the time. I'm
Okay.
afraid the American records are something which I'm completely unfamiliar with. I'd like to know, for instance, William Trent's youngest brother, Thomas Trent, perhaps he actually went out to America as well. I mean, it would make sense that he would join the family out in America. So it would be really nice if somebody were to investigate some of the early American records to see whether or not any more of the family came out rather than just James, Morris, and William. But no, I have absolutely no record of William Jr. marrying whilst in Britain.
I have a couple of other questions. If anybody would like to ask a question, unmute yourself and raise your hand, and I will try to find you and call on you. Victoria.
Hi, great to meet you. And I actually have great-grandparents buried in Inverness. They were, as a matter of fact, from what I understand, I don't know if this is true or not, but it's the family story, that my great-grandmother was a clan chief of the Gordon clan. I am wearing the red Gordon. That is my Gordon. My Gordon runs through my family. And so my question to you is, you showed that wonderful tell, because I'm an archaeologist, of the rampart for the citadel. Do you know how many excavations have been done there over the years? And if so, if there's artifacts that were found, where are they housed now? So in my next trip to Scotland, I would love to come to visit it. Thank you.
Well, there are a few bits and pieces that have come up, more actually from by accident rather than by calculated archaeological investigation. You must understand, most of the citadel is now actually an enormous oil tank farm, as it's called. So it's all covered, in fact, by other development. And it's only really that part of that rampart. Actually, there's another wee part of the rampart elsewhere that are available. They are scheduled monuments, and which means that you're not actually allowed to go digging in them. So at some point in time, it would be nice. I showed a backhoe. I mentioned the story of the backhoe operator who thought it was just a big pile of soil and started digging away in it. It would have been really nice if he'd actually come across something interesting when he was doing it. But there are artifacts from that period held in Inverness Museum. So if you're over at some point in time, go into Inverness Museum and have a look at some of the artifacts that are in there, and you'll actually see artifacts from that period in the museum there.
Great, thank you. I see Bob has his hand raised. Bob Craig.
Hi, thanks, Sam. I want to clarify one issue here. The 1719 William Trent House, the construction was begun in 1719. It carried on through at least the autumn of 1721, at which point the house was completed sufficiently for the Trents to occupy it.
Yeah.
And my question is this: are there any Scottish sources, manuscript sources, that would shed light on the construction of the house, any of the materials that went into the construction of the house, or who the people, the individuals were who worked on the construction. I've been studying this issue, and I have some conjectures as to who might have been working on the house, but I have not found the smoking gun.
When William Trent left the area, it's almost as if he drew a complete line underneath that part of his life, because I've found no manuscripts or any other sources relating to that period of his life here in Scotland. It's disappointing in a way, but I suspect there might have been some litigation if he'd actually reappeared here in Scotland, from people still pursuing various debts. So he was probably quite keen actually not to re-establish contact back in Scotland. But sadly, no, I've not found any manuscripts or sources of material relating to that period of his life within the sources here that I've been accessing in Edinburgh and Inverness.
Bob, I would love for you to contact me to tell us more about what you've been finding out and researching.
I would love to. I'd love to do a program on this.
Well, send me. I will put my email address in the chat to you, or in a little note to you. And if you want to do the same, we can be in touch. When we've had archaeological work done on site, there have been found the same kind of fragments of the same kind of yellow brick that is on the top of the windows, the external, the exterior of the house over the windows, which our archaeology friends have told us were likely ballast from Dutch ships. So I don't know to what extent. Go ahead.
My guess is they were likely freight on Dutch ships, not ballast.
Okay.
I
See,
think
things I gotta know. Yeah.
They may have served the similar purpose to help weight the ship and keep it stable on the water, but they would not have been treated as ballast. They would have been treated as freight.
Thank you for the questions, and thank you for offering to give us a talk and tell us what you know.
I would say one other thing, they would have been there because they would have been a special product that was unavailable in the colonies, especially in the colonies so young as New Jersey and Pennsylvania were, very much in their sort of coming out of their toddlerhood and into their childhood, as it were, beyond their infancy, but still, their toddlerhood was not very far in the rearview mirror.
Right.
And it turns out that it is possible to identify actually thousands of individuals who worked in one or another of the building trades in the colonies.
Right.
And I've been, if you look at early Trenton, the village of Trenton in the 1720s, there are several individuals who worked in various building trades, including one plasterer who might have worked on the Trent House. And certainly did work for the Trent family, for other buildings that they owned. It's a little bit of a complicated picture. But I have yet to find any clear, convincing evidence of any of the individuals that they worked on the Trent House itself, although it seems unlikely that being in Trenton and working for the Trent family, that it just seems that they might very well have worked on that house.
Sure.
But I have not found any, let alone laid out the whole cast of characters who would have worked on it. There would have been a lot of laborers in addition to the skilled tradesmen who would work on it.
Yeah.
We will
be,
potential candidates, but not a lot
Yeah.
of evidence nailing them down.
we'll be in touch. But I
Um,
want to ask Jim another question. When you talked about one of the ships capturing another ship and taking all the cargo and being able to sell it, was that considered piracy?
Well, it was piracy really, but in fact it was perfectly legal to do so at the time if it was a country at which you were at war. So I suspect this was during the Dutch Wars, and it would be a Dutch ship that had been captured, and hence that was perfectly legitimate to do so. And other countries did exactly the same thing the other way around, so that crossing the Atlantic eventually required there to be several warships to actually accompany the fleet of merchant ships in order to defend them against the predations of well, essentially they were pirates, but legitimate pirates, as it were.
From their own country's point of view, did they need to have some kind of warrant? So maybe the wrong word, permission from the government to act in that way, or could they do that on their own? And if they did capture something, they didn't have to give anything to the government. They could just sell.
Well, the government were very pleased that they would be doing so, because what happened would be that the ships would actually end up as their own. So they'd be added to the, if it was part of the British Navy that had captured it, then you'd be pretty sure that that ship that they'd captured would soon actually be part of the British Navy and re-equipped for that very purpose. But no, they're only too pleased that when the ships of other countries were captured. And it was all profit, as I say, for them.
Bob, I see your hands up again. I want to make sure that there aren't any other questions or any other comments people would like to make. And I have one more. But Bob, go ahead.
I wanted to add to Jim's answer to address your question. In later time, at least, the permission that you're talking about came to be called a letter of marque, M-A-R-Q-U-E. And so ship captains would be issued these letters of marque that would legitimize their piracy. And I believe that the captures, the prizes, would be adjudicated in admiralty courts. Jim, is that what you you understand?
I have indeed seen that exactly where, but the cases I've seen actually were where things were washed up on the beach, where where there'd be a wreck or something like this, and that was very much the admiralty courts that were active in that. But it may well be that the prize ships also were adjudicated in the admiralty courts.
And there'd be an auction of the assets that were seized, and a large portion would go to the captors, and a portion would go to the government, as I understand.
Probably, yeah, sounds right. So here's my other question, and then if there are no others, we'll wrap it up.
Sam, I did see a question there about.
Oh, you did? Okay, good.
I can't see it now, but it was a question about when did William Trent, when did he move from Inverness to America?
Yeah.
I think I saw that question earlier on. That's a bit complicated to answer because he seems to have done it at least twice. Because we know that he was in London in 1799. We know that he was in America before that, and he was certainly in America after that. So the truth is, I don't know, but he did it more than once. And of course, these guys at that time, they were they were actual mariners as well. So they would be traveling with ships all the time with their cargoes. So that, who knows, he may have made that trip many times over.
Was he going between London and the colonies? Because you said earlier that he really sort of cut his ties to Scotland.
Yeah, the last time I see him in Scotland was at the baptism of one of his sister's triplets.
Huh.
And he came up from London to Inverness on that particular occasion. And that's the last time I actually see him, so in Scotland.
Huh. Well, here's my other question. And you mentioned this briefly. Morris, who we over here call Maurice, but Morris of Leith, and some scandal, I guess, related to indentured servants. And we've heard rumors of that over here as well. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yes, it wasn't so much the indentured servants. I mean, to explain to anybody who doesn't know the indentured servant story, if somebody wanted to go to America, it would cost money, but you could actually sign yourself up to be an indentured servant, and you'd go over and work for nothing. But at the end, you would actually get your passage across and your food and so on, and then you'd work for a period of time to work out your indenture, and then you'd be free to set yourself up as however you wanted. But the scandal associated with Morris and Morris and the James and Morris in particular, his nephews, related to non-indentured servants, where they were actually just grabbing people off the street and carrying them off to America, and then taking them to a court in America, where they would then be given either a 5-year or a 10-year indenture. So they were just the Morris was very clever the way he went about it. He actually persuaded the powers that be in Scotland to give him powers to seize vagrants off the street. We said this would be good for them. It would be good. It would be good for Scotland. It would be good for them to actually have honest employment. So he actually got dispensation from the government here to actually take vagrants off the street, but he seemed to get carried away. And in some cities, Aberdeen seems to be a particular favourite, they actually seized quite a number of relatively young children from the street and carried them off to America. And it's, if you look at the early Pennsylvanian court cases, you can see many of these children then being subsequently taken into court to be given indentures forcibly once they'd arrived in America. So it is a wee bit of a scandal, which it is never one that's made the headlines, but I'm sure at some point in time it will be one of these sort of cases that gets much more publicity and exposure. But it is a wee bit of a shocker, but it seems to be an accepted practice at the time, quite shockingly. And one of the things is, you see, to make a profit on a voyage, you needed a cargo in both directions. So you'd be taking from America to here, and what could you take in the opposite direction? Well, people is the unfortunate logical one. But as I say, the indentured servant situation was a perfectly legal and above board situation. It didn't work out well for a lot of them, obviously, because it was a pretty tough voyage, and then it was pretty tough conditions within a lot of the households where they ended up. So it wasn't ideal, but it was legal.
All right. So Jim, may we share your email with anyone who'd like to follow up with you on other questions?
Yes, of course.
Okay, very good. So we will forward any other questions that you have to Jim. He has been so generous in helping us sort out one of our exhibits that we've had, which is the family tree, and trying to figure out who was actually there and who wasn't there. And so that and this wonderful talk, thank you so much. It's been great. I have recorded this, so in a little bit, I see Denise McCormick is on the line with us, and she will make it into a beautiful video for us to post for anybody who hasn't heard it or who'd like to hear it again. So thank you very much. Thank everyone for coming. And check out our upcoming events, particularly Hogmanay, if you're interested in Scottish traditions. Thanks, Jim. Thank you all.